By the end of today's episode, you will have learned how overlooked and underrepresented the critically endangered large-antlered muntjac is, as well as the work of some amazing people and organisations fighting for their survival. Welcome, fellow wildlife warriors, to the Conservationists Assemble, the podcast that seeks to unite with Earth's mightiest conservation heroes to raise the profile of our planet's most threatened species, putting the spotlight on the amazing work of zoos and in-situ organisations fighting for their survival and highlighting where there is room for more crucial work still needed to be done. I am your host, Captain Conservation, aka Johnny Bloxham, and I am inviting you to join me as we take the fight to our planet's biggest villain and my arch nemesis, extinction. This week's episode is all about the large-antlered muntjac, and I've teamed up with Dr. Andrew Tilker of Rewild and the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Berlin, who has the intel required to brief us all on what it is going to take to defeat extinction. Will you join the fight? Andrew, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. How's it going?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Great. Glad to hear you're doing well, and I'm super excited, as I know you are, to talk about the large-antlered muntjac. So, to get started, could you just introduce our listeners to the world of the large-antlered muntjac for us, please?
Sure. So the large-antlered muntjac is a type of deer that's found only in Southeast Asia, and specifically it's found in the Annamite Mountains of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia.
What else do we know? Obviously, in comparison to, say, for example, the muntjac that we would see here in the UK, do we know much about them in terms of how similar maybe their ecology is to that species or other species of muntjac?
Yeah, it's a good question. The honest answer is that we don't know so much, and there are a few reasons for that. One is that the species was only scientifically described in the mid 1990s, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it for a large mammal. It inhabits some very remote and rugged terrain on the border of Vietnam and Laos and a small part of Cambodia. So it's a difficult environment to work in. And then finally, there's the fact that it's just so rare. So there haven't been a lot of studies that have focused specifically on large-antlered muntjac. Obviously, we know it's a herbivore. We know that it occurs in wet evergreen tropical rainforest, and we know it's a solitary species. But outside of those pretty general aspects of its ecology, we know surprisingly little.
So then, would you say we're in quite a unique or quite an interesting point in terms of the conversations that we're having surrounding this species, because we're pretty much starting from scratch, which is something that we don't necessarily do as much these days, certainly not for mammals.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think if you look at large mammals in Southeast Asia or even globally, there aren't a lot that rise to this level of unknownness, if you can say that. So there's a lot to find out about the species, about its ecology, about its behavior. It's really a blank slate. The challenge, of course, is protecting the species so that we have the opportunity to learn these interesting aspects of its ecology.
How for a species that we've very recently discovered, essentially, um, how's it got to the point of being as rare as it is, whilst seemingly being under the radar?
That's a really good question. So I think the best way to answer that is to talk a little bit about the threats. And so in Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, in the Annamite Mountains, habitat loss and habitat degradation has been a substantial threat within recent decades. Most of this region has lost a large proportion of its primary forest cover. But that said, the main threat to large-antlered muntjac and any other mammal or ground-dwelling bird in the region is widespread snaring to fuel the ubiquitous illegal wildlife trade in the region. So I'm not sure how much you know about snaring or the snaring crisis, but essentially, because there's such a heavy demand for wild meat in the commercial bushmeat trade in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, there are quite literally millions of snares in the protected areas of this region. A colleague of mine estimated that there are probably on the order of 12 million snares in the protected areas of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia alone, and that's likely an extreme underestimate. And so when you have that level of snaring pressure in the forests of the Annamites, it's not surprising that many forests are depleted of wildlife, and indeed some forests are almost completely empty. Now, that is a shame for wildlife species in the region, but it's a conservation tragedy for species that only occur in the Annamites. Because if those species are lost from the Annamites, they're lost globally, and that equates to global extinction. So that's the short answer to why this species is so rare, is because there's such high illegal poaching through the setting of wire snares across the region. In terms of how it's flown under the radar, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a great answer. The best I can come up with is that because it's a deer, there's a perception within the public, and I think even within some government counterparts, that it must be common because other deer species are common in the region. Deer are generally believed to be resilient to even moderate levels of hunting pressure. And so I think there's a false perception, a widespread and false perception, that large-antlered muntjac is still doing okay because it's a deer and deer are around these forests.
Yeah, I could certainly see, yeah, why that kind of attitude and that mindset would be adopted, and so certainly, then would you say that opens doors to a large effort of the conservation surrounding this species just being the mindset or changing that mindset that we're adopting for this species, but also I suppose then for just those species that we do deem to be safe.
Absolutely. I think communication, education, outreach is really the first step to raising the profile of the large antlered muntjac and highlighting just how dire the conservation situation is for the species. Because we have so little time, I think, to save the species, we have to do many things in parallel, but certainly engaging stakeholders to just make people aware of the situation is one of the first steps that we need to take. And my colleagues and I are having those conversations. They need to happen faster and they need to happen at higher levels of government. But we are trying to change that mindset within the conservation communities and with government stakeholders in the range states.
And actually, yeah, just taking it back to what you mentioned earlier about how your colleagues estimated, millions of snares within protected areas. As obviously it's great that those protected areas exist, despite the fact that people are still going in and setting up snares. Would we then use that as a basis to say that the areas outside of their protected habitat are just even more threatened, or the kind of attitude towards snaring in those environments is even more dire?
Probably so. We don't have good data on hunting pressure outside of protected areas in this region, to my knowledge. But it is logical that because protected areas provide some level of protection in the region, that the situation is probably much worse outside of the protected area network than inside. Um, Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, large-antlered muntjac populations are so depleted that it's unlikely that there are populations or many populations outside of protected areas in the region. Um, my colleagues and I have been working on a species status assessment for the past year to gather all available information about the species and where it occurs, where it doesn't occur. And we think there are probably four or five, maybe six true populations of the species left, and they're all within protected areas. So there could be a few animals outside of protected areas and outside of these populations, but we think it's probably unlikely. So our best bet at protecting the species in the wild is to strengthen protected area management in within those areas that hold the last strongholds for the species.
Yeah, certainly. And so then I suppose because we don't know much about this species, there's a lot of stuff that is probably gonna, hopefully come out in certainly near future via research and conservation action. So I suppose it's really now time to highlight, as much as we'd love to talk about the species in a lot more detail, to highlight the organisations that are on the front lines doing that research and doing that work. So yeah, Andrew, could you please just give us an insight into some of the organisations that exist for the conservation of the large-antlered muntjac?
Absolutely. Well, I should mention that the organizations that I work with are, of course, actively engaged in the conservation of the large-antlered muntjac. I work for an organization called Rewild, which is a conservation NGO that's based in America but works globally. And in that role, I we support local partners in conservation of what we call underfrogs, which just means overlooked species that haven't been subject to high levels of conservation investment by other stakeholders. And so the large antlered muntjac really fits this perfectly, right? Because it is a species that's on the brink of extinction, and which isn't getting much conservation support, or at least not as much conservation support as is needed to prevent its extinction. So my organization, Rewild, of course, is engaged in helping to protect the species. I also have a part-time position at a research institute in Berlin called the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research. And in that role, we focus more on kind of the science biodiversity monitoring side of things in the Annamides, and that includes searching for additional populations of large antlered muntjac, monitoring existing populations using rigorous approaches so that we can provide stakeholders with the best science possible to guide evidence-based conservation decisions. Sorry, I know this is a long answer, but I want to highlight that outside of the organizations I work with, the main work that's being done to protect the species are by stakeholders in the range countries. So conservation organizations and government stakeholders working in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. There are an especially great group of local NGOs in these countries that are on the front lines of protecting large antlered muntjac and many other species. Organizations like Association Anulac and Green Viet that are driving conservation for large antlered muntjac in these last strongholds. And so my role, as I see it, is as someone who supports these local NGOs and local government stakeholders who are really doing the hard work of trying to protect this species.
Well, it's fantastic that you've, yeah, certainly highlighted those other organisations that are, as present, if not a little bit more so, in large antlered muntjac conservation. So speaking of your role, because you are also the EEP coordinator for the large antlered muntjac, so just talk us through how that works. As to if correct me if I'm wrong, by all means, there are no large antlered muntjac that we know of in ex situ populations.
It's a good question. And you're right, there are no large antlered muntjac that we know of in ex situ populations anywhere in the world. So I am leading the EEP for large antlered muntjac, and this is a bit of an experiment, to be honest. Usually EEP coordinators help manage collections of animals that are in existing ex situ facilities in Europe. Um, the fact that that I'm leading an EEP for large antlered muntjac is really an experiment to try to get additional support from the zoo community to protect the species in the range states. And so it's more of a mechanism to engage zoos to raise the profile of large antlered muntjac within those communities and hopefully garner support to promote conservation for the species, both financial support or in-kind technical support, whatever is needed in the large antlered muntjac conservation context.
Fantastic. Yeah, it certainly sounds like a key element, and yeah, I think it is something that the zoo should be doing more of, even if they're not necessarily housing them. Is yeah, trying to help raise the profile and that awareness of those species. So yeah, I look forward to seeing how that unfolds, and yeah, I think it's great that kind of that experiment is happening, and hopefully would help lead way to maybe other species again. You've mentioned some of the government organisations that are kind of there to aid the support. What kind of support is that, or what kind of form is that aid coming in at the moment?
So the government stakeholders, well, many forms to be honest. We engage with government stakeholders primarily in kind of two areas around large antlered muntjac. The first is strengthening protected area management so that the remaining populations of large antlered muntjac in the wild in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are as secure as possible. So obviously there is this Southeast Asian snaring crisis across Southeast Asia, not just the Annamites. And addressing that crisis is going to be key to protecting these populations in the wild and many other species that live in this region as well. The other area where we're increasingly engaging with government counterparts is around the need to establish an ex situ conservation breeding population for large antlered muntjac. And indeed, in my personal view, this is among the most urgent conservation tasks to try to save the species from extinction. Um, Decreasing threats and protecting the species in the wild is going to be extremely difficult and likely will take a long time to achieve. And there is a concern among conservationists, and I count myself in this as well, that we might not have enough time left to save the species in the wild, given the scale of the threats and the complexity of the situation. And so, increasingly, there are conversations with government stakeholders about the need to establish an urgent ex situ population in one of the range states as a way to ensure that the species doesn't go extinct while we're working to reduce threats in the wild.
Absolutely, and it's always nice to hear that the government aid is there, because it makes you kind of, certainly from us, in a very detached or very kind of distant perspective,
Mhm.
makes you feel like that they're proud that these species exist. And
Mhm.
again, certainly ones that aren't necessarily classified as an iconic species. So it must be incredibly rewarding and motivating to just be having those conversations with government
Mhm.
stakeholders, like you say.
Mhm. Yeah.
So going forward, obviously you've mentioned kind of the funding and the awareness. What more do you think conservation organisations, be that in situ or ex situ, can do while they're waiting to kind of see what advances are happening?
Oh, it's a really good question. I mean, the straightforward, maybe boring answer is that we need more financial support, we need more technical support, and we need more awareness, both in the range states and in the world more generally, about the critical situation of the species. Despite the fact that there are a handful of great organizations and people in NGOs and in government championing the conservation of large-antlered muntjac, it's not enough to move things along as quickly as we need. And so the simple answer is that we need all hands on deck to raise the profile of the species, have greater awareness about its conservation situation. And then we need the resources and the political support and the technical support needed to implement the conservation actions that we need to save the species. And so it's a bit of a all hands on deck type situation.
Yeah, certainly sounds like it. But yeah, I think, once I think good zoos hopefully get a sniff of it, it shouldn't take long, hopefully, before that awareness starts getting raised, and hopefully that support will then continue to snowball and drive
Mhm.
forward.
Mhm.
So, Andrew, yeah, you've given us a fantastic insight into the world of the large and the muntjac and the organisations that are fighting hard to try and save them, with the highlight of their future actions. So now we just want to uncover your origin story and perhaps inspire origin stories of our listeners. So just walk us through your background and how you got to where you are today.
Good question. I grew up in America, in Texas. As you can probably tell, I don't have a very German accent. And I've always been interested in tropical ecology. But once I started actually volunteering and spending more time in the tropics, I realized very quickly that I didn't want to become a scientist studying what was happening in the tropics because there has been so much environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. And so I decided at a fairly early age in my career that I wanted to work in conservation because I wanted to do something about the situation that I saw around me. And that sent me on a path towards working in conservation in the tropics in general. I've also always been drawn to very rare mammals, and especially very rare mammals that are overlooked or which for which very little is known. There is an element of excitement in working on a species or in an ecosystem that for which very little is known, to be the first or among the first to learn the secrets of some of these species. And so that pulled me in the direction of working in areas that have had relatively little exploration or conservation engagement, and on species that were flying under the radar or for which very little was known. And through a series of events, I somehow landed in Vietnam about 12 years ago, and discovered that here was an entire world of very rare species, very rare mammal species, many of which that were on the brink of extinction, that not many people knew, had much information about, and which badly needed conservation actions and conservation champions. And so when I landed in Vietnam, I found a place that I felt that, well, hopefully I felt that I could um, do some conservation good, and which was also an exciting place to work because there was so much to do and so much was unknown. And so that's how I stumbled into working in Vietnam, and more specifically on large-antlered muntjac. I did my master's degree and my doctorate degree in Vietnam and Laos on rare Annamite mammal species and their conservation. And since then, I suppose I haven't looked back.
Yeah, so yeah, let's dive deeper into that. What first surprised you, perhaps, when you first maybe you got into the Annamite region and you started seeing some of these mammals that perhaps weren't necessarily that well described?
Hmm. I think the first thing that surprised me was the level of threat and the fact that many of the forest ecosystems, including in some well-known, long-established national parks, were essentially empty of wildlife because historical and current snaring pressure was so high. And there was a disconnect with many of the stakeholders that I spoke with in the general public or in conservation NGOs or in the government about how bad the situation was. And so that really set off alarm bells in my head, because if so many forests were so empty, it indicated to me that the situation for many of these Annamite endemic species, including the large-antlered muntjac, could be much worse than many people realized. And so that was the first one of my first insights, depressing as it was. But after that, I also realized how much support and how much potential there was for working with local stakeholders to save these species from extinction and hopefully reverse declines and have thriving populations in the wild in the future. I've had the pleasure of working with some absolutely amazing organizations and people in both Vietnam and Laos who are committed to species conservation and committed in a way because these species are such integral parts of their own natural heritage for these countries. And so to me, it was a bit of a double-edged sword. Yes, the threats are extremely high and the situation is fairly dire for many of these species, including large-antlered muntjac. And yet there is a foundation of support with some excellent people working to reverse the situation. And that gives me sign for hope. And it still does.
Great, yeah, it's certainly always nice to keep reflecting on what gives you motivation and use that motivation to not only enhance your own output, but yeah, to have those conversations with other people and to be like, oh, look, this is why we should be doing what we're
Mhm.
doing. So, is
Yeah.
there one lesson that you say that your role has taught you?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Don't give up hope. I've, working on extremely rare species that are truly on the brink of extinction is hard work and it can be very depressing work, to be blunt. And yet, as I reflect back on my conservation career and think about all of the amazing networks that I've been able to be a part of, and the people that I've worked with, it's that yes, the threats are high, the challenges are immense, but you're not alone in this fight, of course. And the fact that there are so many other good people working towards protecting biodiversity, it gives me sign for it gives me reasons for hope. And so whenever I'm facing an especially challenging day or week or issue in working on these very rare species, I often try to reflect back on the other people who are there to support you in the same way that I'm there to support them, and how things are never as dire as they seem, and that there's always cause to be hopeful that we can save these species and that we can actually have thriving populations in the future.
Yeah, and on that note of kind of the people that have been alongside you throughout your career, have you had any influences or mentors or kind of what was some of the best advice you received gearing up for a conservation career?
Yeah, I've been privileged to have several really great mentors. my colleague at Rewild, Barney Long, first got me to Vietnam and really helped me become established there, and continues to mentor me to this day on conservation in the region, including on large-antlered muntjac. And I've also been privileged enough to, I think I can say this, to be mentors for young conservation scientists from the region who hold the future of large-antlered muntjac and many other species in their hands, and which I think have the potential to not only save these species from extinction, but as I said earlier, to actually make sure that they fulfill their role in these ecosystems as thriving populations. And so I've seen both sides of it. I've benefited from mentoring, and I've also provided insight to people who are just getting started in their conservation career. I think the best advice that I've gotten, or the best one of the key lessons learned from my conservation career, is that individual people don't save species, or they rarely save species. There are some amazing examples of people who have made incredible contributions to species conservation. But I think overall that the true power to save species from extinction lies in partnerships. And so wherever I work, I try to invest as much as possible in partnerships, because with collaborative efforts, with many people working towards a shared vision, I think you can have exponentially greater effect on conservation goals than you could with from any one person going it alone. And so it's the value of conservative partnerships and collaboration, I think, that is really stuck with me as I look back on the work that I've done, and which I would encourage other people starting out in conservation to think about as they think through how they want to have their mark, or how they want to have their impact on threatened species.
Absolutely. And looking forward then, because it's always nice to reflect back, but looking forward, what else would you like to achieve in your career?
Oh, so much. It's a it's a hard question to answer. Um, I think when you're working in conservation, there are very few milestones that mark the close of a project or a species saved. I think conservation, especially when working with critically endangered species, it's a long-term game, and so it's hard for me to think of any kind of definite milestones that I think I could achieve and move on to the next species or ecosystem. But if I didn't have to think about that, I would say that for the Annamites, establishing ex situ conservation breeding populations for some of the very threatened species like large-antlered muntjac, but also including Annamite striped rabbit, and another small ungulate called the silverback chevrotain, establishing those ex situ populations so that there are insurance populations would be a major achievement. Certainly not something I would do alone, but would be done with the excellent network of partners that I'm privileged to work with. So that would be amazing. I think if I reflect back on the work that I've enjoyed the most and that I think has had the most impact, it would be mentoring young up and coming conservationists working in the region. And so I would also like to have much more spend much more of my time and energy mentoring and encouraging people from these countries to get into conservation professionally, because I also think that's where we're going to have the greatest impact long term on threatened species and threatened ecosystems. So doing much more mentoring would also be something that I want to do more in the future.
That sounds awesome. So, what a great origin story you've had, Andrew. To close out our conversation today, we're just going to have some quick fire questions to finish up on. Are you ready?
Sure.
Great. So, you've obviously had the opportunity to see some amazing wildlife in Vietnam, and I'm sure probably back home in America as well. But are there any dream species that you'd love to work with or to see in the wild?
Whoa, good question. I mean, obviously, I would love to see large-antlered muntjac in the wild. That would be pretty high on the list. I was involved in work to document the Attenborough's echidna, long-beaked echidna, on in the Indonesian side of Papua, and we got the animal on camera trap. I would love to see one in the wild, and I would also like to study the species more in the future.
That'd be cool. Yeah, fair play. Absolutely. How about places that you'd love to visit? Are there any specific countries or regions that you'd love to pay visit to?
Mm. I've never been to Africa actually, so I would like to go to Africa, of course, to see the great, the great diversity of game. But specifically, I would like to go to Ethiopia. It's a country in a region that's always held a fascination for me.
Yeah, also I've also never been to Africa. It kind of feels blasphemous as someone that works with exotic wildlife, isn't it, to say that
Yeah.
you've never been to Africa? But yeah, hopefully one day we'll both get out there.
Mhm.
If you could be an animal, what would you be and why?
It's a hard one. I think I would say a mountain tapir because who would not want to be a chocolate covered furry tapir?
Yeah, definitely. They've got this, well, aside from the threats, quite an idyllic lifestyle, isn't it?
Hmm.
Just wandering through the rainforest.
Hmm.
Yeah, fantastic answer. After a day fighting extinction, how do you unwind?
Either going out with friends and having a drink or playing with my dog, who is, yeah, like a member of the family.
Fantastic. Okay, just a couple last questions then. How can listeners follow your work and the work of Rewild or the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research?
Yep, best ways to look us up online, www.rewild.org. And for the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research, it's a long name. I can't remember the website off the top of my head, but Google it and you'll find us.
Yeah, I will say to listeners, I will also link to both those organisations in the show notes as well. So, last one then, do you have any last messages for our listeners or any key takeaways from today's episode?
The fighting for the protection of very rare species is challenging and it's hard, and sometimes it can even be depressing. And yet, I think it's among the most rewarding struggles that someone who's interested in biodiversity can engage in. So, if you're interested in having a career in conservation and working on very rare species that need champions, that need voices, dive into it because we need all the help we can get. And if you want guidance or mentorship or support, reach out to those people in the field who are working in this area, and reach out to me if I can help.
Fantastic point to finish up on there. So, Andrew, thank you so much for your time and gracing the podcast with your presence and knowledge on just trying to raise the profile of such a overlooked species. And certainly we wish you all the support going forward with your work in the Annamites and hopefully there's potential for future conversations when that work is starting to pick up. So yeah, we'll be keeping a close eye on all of the work surrounding the large-antlered muntjac.
Thank you so much for having me.
And as always, a huge shout out to you, the Conservationists Assemble community, for joining the mission briefing on the large-antlered muntjac. If you enjoyed this volume of the podcast and wish to join the fight, please follow the podcast and share with your family and friends to help stack the odds in conservation's favour. And don't forget, there are plenty of ways that you can get involved with the podcast, be that suggesting species, guests or organisations that you would love to hear episodes on, or even if it's just sending your photos, videos or stories of your favourite species or trips to zoos or seeing animals in the wild. You can send your suggestions on Instagram or email the podcast HQ on conservationists@outlook.com. That email address is in the show notes alongside the website for Rewild and the website for the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research. Do check out those organisations as well. Until next time, Captain Conservation signing off, over and out.